The American Chess Cup, Day 4, presented us with a breathtaking match between Lenier Dominguez and Sam SAVIAN. Maybe not exactly household names like Caruana and Nakamura, but those two gentlemen are ranked 6th and 7th in the list of the best US chess players. Also, both are absolute gentlemen on and off the board. Hope you stay for the whole video, as the match was really exciting and featured brilliant moves, as well as the blunders even the beginners rarely make. The first game, rapid game, 25 minutes each, and Dominguez starts with e4, e6, d4, Savian plays d5, and we have classical variation of French defense. Knight f6, e5 hitting the knight, knight moves back to d7, f4, c5, typical move in French defense to undermine white center, knight develops to f3, knight c6, bishop goes to e3, all standard, all theory, a6, knight moves back to e2 with the idea to play the pawn to c3 to support the pawn on d4, queen b6, putting pressure on both pawns d4 and attacking the pawn on b2, queen c1 protecting the pawn on b2, bishop develops to e7 preparing the short castle, c3, castle, and h4. White start aggressively attacking on the king side of the board, f6, undermining white pawn structure, the pawn chain, h5, with the idea to move forward to h6. Savian doesn't allow this by blocking that pawn with h6, but weakening white squares around the king. And immediately rook h3, with the idea to put the rook on g3 and start attacking the black king on a g-file. Rook f7 preemptively protecting the pawn on g7. King goes to f2 and he feels very safe at that square. Exchange of the pawns on e5. White didn't want to take with the f pawn because that will open the f file for the rook. So d takes e5 and immediately d4 from Savian, opening the position in the middle. Exchange of the pawns on d4, knight takes d4 and bishop c5, creating a lot of pressure in the center of the board. Knight takes c6, bishop takes e3 with the check, queen takes e3, queen takes b2, check, king moves away, queen takes the rook on a1, and knight d8 attacking the rook on f7 and the pawn on e6, and rook goes to e7 to protect that pawn. So let's take a breather here. What happened? White is without an exchange and still have slightly better position because the rook on a8, bishop on c8 never entered the game, and it will take some time to get them into the game, and the rook on e7 is glued to protecting the pawn on e6. Queen on a1, how often do you find the queen on a1, and the knight on d8 for white? Crazy position. Dominguez plays rook g3, queen goes to b1 to get back into the game, knight d4 attacking the pawn on e6 with both knights. Again, how strange this knight looks on the square d8. Queen b6, knight takes the pawn on d6, on e6, and here is a tactical shot, knight takes e5. Now, I want to mention that black couldn't take the knight on e6 because after rook takes e6, knight takes e6, queen takes e6, everything is more or less okay for black. But after rook takes e6, there is bishop c4 pinning that rook, and that would create massive problems for black in this position. But Savian found a nice tactical shot and played knight takes e5, using this diagonal as a pin. Queen takes e5, white couldn't take the knight with the pawn, because then the knight on e6 would be under attack, because queen e5 protects the knight, but again, there is a pin, and that's why bishop takes e6, and knight cannot take back the bishop as it's pinned. King has to move away to free up the knight on d4, and brilliant move from SAVIAN, taking the pawn with the bishop on a2 and sacrificing the rook on e7. Queen takes e7. The checkmate is real, is the threat, but after queen takes e5, the queen actually protects the pawn on g7, and we have a position after queen takes b7 and rook f8. We have a position with equal material and equal in any way you want to slice it. It's a drawish game. But again, it's a blitz game at this point because SAVIAN has only 33 seconds to go on the clock. And believe it or not, Dominguez has 16 minutes remaining on the clock. And that made the difference. Queen takes a6. And here comes queen takes f4. Inexplicable blunder by one of the top grandmasters in the world. He just didn't notice that Dominguez will take the bishop with the check. And he is in no time to capture the bishop back on f1. So queen a2 check, king has to move away to h8, and with an extra piece, the conversion here was pretty quick. I'm gonna show you quickly the moves. Nothing much happening here. With an extra piece, a player of Dominguez strengths has no issues winning this position. So after queen a8 check, king h7, exchange of the queens, and in this position, SAVIAN resigned, as this is totally winning for white, but white has to be actually careful here and make sure that they keep the pawn on g3 on the board. The reason being because, let me just quickly show you, just as an example, if these pawns will be exchanged, this is already a draw, because the promotion square h8 is a black square, and the white bishop is a light square bishop. So the king will just go to h8, and there is no way for white to promote this pawn on h8, as the king is going to be there, and you cannot get it out of there because, again, you cannot check that king with the light square bishop. Dominguez won the first game playing with 96% accuracy, pretty amazing, and leads the match 1-0. Game 2, rapid game, 25 minutes each. SAVIAN playing white starts with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5. We have a Jacobiano game, c3, d3, slow variation, classical variation of this opening. Bishop jumps to g5, h6, bishop moves away to h4, a6, knight develops to d2, bishop goes back to a7 to make sure that when white plays d4, they're not attacking the bishop here on c5. g5, pretty aggressive move on the king side of the board. The bishop moves away and short castle. And the king is pretty safe here, although the pawns are already extended. There is nothing white can immediately do to undermine this position for black. a4, not to allow the move b5, king goes to g7, rook develops to c1, knight moves back to e7 with the ideas in some positions to play c6 and then d5 to take control of the center for black, but white plays d4, immediately undermining black's pawn structure, and knight h5 to exchange the bishop on g3. White takes the pawn on e5, black takes the bishop on g3, h takes g3, and d takes e5, knight takes e5. Black sacrificed a pawn for initiative. Now they have two very, very good bishops, and this makes this position slightly better for black, according to the engines. Queen d6 hitting the knight on e5, and knight takes f7. Normally not a good exchange for white to take this pawn and give up a bishop and the knight for the rook. Not again the best move, but in this game SAVIAN must win in order to continue the match, because he lost the first game. So he has to create some imbalances in the position, some complications, even though it's not objectively the best moves, but he has to play aggressively and maybe sometimes with unusual moves to get Dominguez out of his preparation. Rook takes f7, bishop takes f7, king takes f7, and king h1. White wants to play f4 and open the f file, but the pawn f was pinned by the bishop on a7, so king h1 is the logical move, and the next move for black is logical as well, g4, to make it more difficult for white to open the file f, because now, let's say, after if white plays f3, black can simply take the pawn on g3. And therefore, white continue with queen b3 check. King g7, rook d1. The queen moves away from d file on c6. Queen a3, actually attacking the knight on e7. Dominguez doesn't blunder it, and it protects it with queen e8. Knight b3, knight goes to some central squares on c5 or d4. Knight c6 and knight d4. Bishop d7, rook e1, exchange of the knights on d4, and bishop takes a4. And we have a position where black has two bishops for the rook, which is advantage black, but white has very nice center, two connected pawns, d4 and e4, without any black pawns on e or d files. So overall position is pretty even. Rook c1, hitting the pawn on c7. Bishop takes d4 for Dominguez. That's a little too greedy in this position. You really should have protected the pawn on c7. Rook takes c7 check, king g8, and queen d6. Hitting the pawn on h6, hitting the bishop on d4, and black king is not safe at all. Bishop e5 seems like a pin on winning the rook, but white simply have a check. Queen d5 check, king h8, and now the rook can move away from the attack. And actually now the bishop is under attack on e5. Bishop goes back to g7. Queen takes the pawn on b7. Rook d4 attacking the rook. Bishop d4 attacking the rook. Rook f5. Bishop d7 attacking the same rook. Rook continues to run away. Bishop e5. Dominguez is persistent on attacking the rook. Nice tactical shot. Rook f7. That was the only move to protect the rook. And now if queen takes f7, queen would take the rook on a8 with the check. So Dominguez doesn't do that and plays bishop c6. And now white have to be careful to make sure that they would move the queen away from the attack and also protect the rook on f7 at the same time, and they do that by moving the queen to b3. Dominguez continues to pursue the queen with rook b8. Again, white has to stay on this diagonal to make sure that the rook is protected, and they do that by queen c4. Bishop b5 attacking the rook again. Queen stays on the same diagonal still. Bishop d7, queen d5, bishop c6, queen c4. The moves could be repeated here, but SAVIAN must win this game, and therefore in this position he refuses the repetition of the moves, of course, and plays queen c5. And now Dominguez again cannot take the rook on f7, because if he does that, queen will take on e5 with the check, and next move, SAVIAN will take the rook and win the game. Black plays bishop takes b2, and now white, SAVIAN, was winning with the move queen f5, with ideas of checkmating on h7, and black had very difficult time defending against that. But he didn't find it and played rook e7, queen f8, rook b1. And in this position, which is a little better for white, but nothing concrete yet, Dominguez, with 21 seconds on the clock, which is a lot of time, makes a move that most of the beginners will not make, but somehow he blundered the queen. Queen takes f2. Queen takes f2, and he made this move after 8 seconds thinking. So this is what pressure and time pressure and emotional pressure of the importance of the tournament does to even the best players in the world. Obviously, you cannot take the pawn on f2 because queen takes f2. White has an extra queen. Dominguez resigned, and the match is even at 1-1, and we have Blitz games. Blitz game number 1. We got to this position. Dominguez is playing white, SAVIAN is playing black. SAVIAN's position is totally winning. An extra pawn, 4 against 3, very active rook, very active king, which is very important in the end games. And SAVIAN plays knight c5. And for the second game in a row, Dominguez, this time with 4 seconds to go, makes an inexplicable mistakes and blunders the rook on e6. He plays knight c6, SAVIAN takes the rook, and Dominguez resigns. So this was the end of Blitz game number 1. And we have Blitz game number 2. And we have the following position on the board. SAVIAN plays white, and Dominguez plays black. Dominguez has an extra rook for the knight, so it's an extra exchange, and 2 extra pawns, 4 against 2. Totally winning position, despite the fact that pawn on e7 is 1 move away from becoming a queen. So rook e3, to make sure that black can sacrifice the rook for that pawn. Knight takes h5, g4, the pawn is moving forward, e7, e8, queen, rook takes e8, king takes e8. White has an extra knight, but not on time to prevent black from promotion one of their 3 pawns. Obviously not so easy, and mistakes will still be made. 8 seconds to go for SAVIAN, 7 seconds to go for Dominguez. King b6, king e7, and the move king c5 turns out to be an absolute mistake, because now this game is a draw. After king e6, b5, knight f4, king c4, and now with 4 seconds to go, SAVIAN had to make a decision whether to move the king to the right or to the left. And believe it or not, one of those moves was a draw, and the other move was losing. And SAVIAN, with 4 seconds to go, here you cannot really blame him to calculate this, even in a serious game would be very difficult, but with 4 seconds to go it was almost impossible, and he guessed wrong and he played king d6, and that was a losing move. After a5, king c6, b4, exchange of the pawns on b4, white simply are not stopping one of those pawns. The king turned out to be out of the game, and the knight cannot work on in both directions. King d6, b3, SAVIAN resigned. Dominguez won the game on demand, basically. If he lost this game or if he drew this game, that the match would be over. But now it's 2-2, and we'll have two more Blitz games. Game 5, SAVIAN is playing white, Dominguez is playing black. E4, C5, now we have Sicilian defense for the first time in this match. D4, exchange of the pawns on D4, knight F6, knight C3, A6, famous Najdorf variation of Sicilian defense, H3, E5 hitting the knight goes back, bishop develops to E6, F4, the first move, which is not the first line of theory in these positions. Usually the bishop just develops to E3 first. F4, more aggressive move from SAVIAN, B5, F5, hitting the bishop. Bishop goes back to C8, and now we can see that 7 out of 8 black pieces are still on the initial squares. They started the game. Bishop G5, knight D7, A4. Now actually the pawn on B5 is under attack because there is a pin, and white would take the pawn on B5, and black cannot take it back because the rook will take the rook on A8 before attacking the knight. The knight goes back to the center of the board, cannot be captured there because black would lose a queen. Bishop B7, bishop develops to C4, bishop E7. White have slight advantage here. Their pieces are just more active, better positioned. Knight takes F6, hitting the pawn on E4, queen D3 protecting that pawn. Exchange of the knights on D5, exchange of the bishops on D5. Bishop jumps to G5, short castle. We have this pretty theoretical position, which is pretty even, with slight advantage to black because the bishop is more active and in general considered a better piece than the knight in those type of positions. Rook E1, queen C7, rook E4 attacking the pawn on B4 from the side, counter-attacking the pawn on C2 for Dominguez, H4 hitting the bishop here, the first strange move of the game. Instead of putting the bishop on a more natural square on F6, Dominguez moves it to H6, which was a little unusual. Rook F2, multi-purpose move. It protects the pawn on C2, and now the pawn on B4 is actually under attack. So A5 protects that pawn, and F6, and therefore that particular move is the reason that bishop H6 was a mistake. F6 is a very unpleasant move for black in this position. They have to play G6, and this pawn on F6 is really a thorn in their position. H5, trying to undermine this triangle of black pawns. Queen goes to D8, and H takes G6. At this point, white's position is already close to winning. In this particular instance, H takes G6 would be a little better, but for some reason F takes G6, and now pawn F is even stronger than before. Queen H4 attacking the bishop. Bishop moves back to F8. Queen E6 check. And after king H8, white plays rook H4. And now SAVIAN, playing white, is having some thoughts on checkmating the opponent on a square H7. Rook C7 protects the pawn on H7 and not allowing the queen to get into a square F7. SAVIAN decided that he remembered that he also has the knight on the board, and decided to get that knight into the game with knight d2, queen d7 offering the exchange of the queens, but simply knight e4 And now black really don't want to take the queen on e6, because after d takes e6, white would have two absolutely monstrous pawns that would be unstoppable. Rook e8 for Dominguez. Now exchange of the queens happens on d7 and f7. The pawn is going forward. Rook e7, and it seems like the pawn on f7 now could be captured, but there is a move knight f6. And it turns out that knight f6 attacked the rook on d7. More importantly, there is a threat of a checkmate on h7. And black cannot take the pawn on f7, because white will simply take a rook, and now you cannot take it back, because rook takes f8, and white will simply have an extra rook. Therefore, in this position, Dominguez plays h6 to protect himself from a checkmate. Knight takes d7, rook takes d7, and with an extra exchange and a monstrous pawn on f7, this is an easy conversion for SAVIAN. So I'll go quickly here. Not much happened. The king is centralized, king e4, rook f5, hitting the bishop here, check, rook g8, bishop moves away, and queen. Dominguez resigned, and SAVIAN is leading 3-2, and we have game 6. We got to this position. Dominguez is playing white, SAVIAN is playing black. 6 pawns against 6 pawns. Kings are safe. Bishop and knight against bishop and knight. 2 rooks against 2 rooks. Absolutely even position. 13 seconds on the clock for Dominguez. 4 seconds on the clock for SAVIAN. Dominguez must win this game to continue with the match. SAVIAN is okay with the draw. Dominguez plays rook d. SAVIAN plays bishop b8, and after rook e1, SAVIAN could win this game with the move knight d3, attacking the rook. And then let's say if rook takes e6, f takes e6, all white pieces are under attack. The knight, the bishop, the rook, and they cannot save all their pieces. The black would simply win the game with 4 seconds to go on the clock. SAVIAN didn't find this winning move and continued with knight g6. After that, there was an exchange of the rooks on e6, f takes e6, bishop takes b8, e takes f5, and we have an absolutely equal endgame. Bishop against knight, 6 pawns against 6 pawns. Dominguez obviously tried his best to create something in this draw position, but was not able to do it. There were a lot of moves, about 50-60 more moves. The players were just shuffling the pieces, ended up in this position, and repeated the moves 3 times. And agreed to a draw, which means Sam SAVIAN is the winner of the match, 3.5 to 2.5, and he advances to the next round and will play Lev Aronian.